In 1980, IBM needed an operating system fast for its first personal computer, and the small company it turned to for help ended up owning more of the future than IBM itself ever would. IBM was racing to enter the personal computer market, a category it had previously dismissed as too small for a company built on mainframe and business computing, under an internal project famously run with unusual speed and secrecy for a company IBM's size. According to the most widely told version of this story, IBM first approached Digital Research, a company run by Gary Kildall that made the leading operating system of the era, CP/M. But that negotiation fell apart, with some historical accounts, disputed in their exact details but broadly agreed upon in outline, describing a missed meeting and stalled talks over licensing terms. Needing a working operating system on a tight deadline, IBM turned instead to a small, then relatively unknown software company called Microsoft, run by a young Bill Gates. Microsoft didn't actually have a finished operating system to offer at that moment either. Instead, Microsoft purchased the rights to an existing operating system called QDOS, built by a small company named Seattle Computer Products, and adapted it into what would become PC-DOS for IBM's new machine, and MS-DOS for licensing everywhere else. Here's the single decision that changed everything. IBM licensed this operating system from Microsoft, but crucially did not insist on exclusive rights to it. Microsoft retained the ability to license that same underlying software to any other computer maker who wanted to build a machine compatible with IBM's new hardware standard. IBM's leadership viewed hardware as the real, valuable business, the thing they understood and had always competed on, and treated the operating system as a minor, replaceable component needed simply to ship a working machine, essentially a commodity part, rather than the strategic asset it would very quickly become. That single, apparently minor licensing decision let Microsoft sell the exact same operating system to every clone manufacturer that began legally reverse engineering and copying IBM's hardware design over the following years, starting most famously with Compaq's legal IBM-compatible portable computer in 1983. As a wave of computer makers, Compaq and later Dell, Gateway, and many others built compatible hardware, they all needed the same underlying operating system to run it, and Microsoft, not IBM, was the company positioned to sell it to every single one of them. IBM kept selling its own boxes, and for a while sold plenty of them. But within a few years, IBM's own share of the very personal computer market it had created began eroding steadily against a flood of cheaper compatible machines, all running the same Microsoft operating system IBM itself had helped make the industry standard. Microsoft ended up owning the software layer that every one of those boxes, IBM's included, actually needed to function at all, and built one of the most valuable companies in the history of business on top of that single non-exclusive license. The advantage compounded further once Microsoft moved from MS-DOS into Windows, first as an add-on layer in the late 1980s, and then as the dominant graphical operating system through Windows 3 in 1990 and Windows 95 later that decade. Every one of those releases ran on the exact same broad base of IBM-compatible hardware that the original non-exclusive DOS license had made possible in the first place, letting Microsoft's dominance compound across an entire additional generation of computing, rather than resetting with each new product cycle. That installed base also became the foundation for an entire third-party software industry writing programs, specifically for Microsoft's operating systems, deepening the lock-in with every new application released, since switching operating systems now meant losing access to software nobody wanted to give up. Within a few years, the market for IBM-compatible personal computers had grown far larger than IBM's own hardware sales alone, and Microsoft's operating system sat underneath nearly all of it, collecting a license fee on machines IBM itself had no direct involvement in building. Here's the part of this story that's genuinely worth sitting with rather than just enjoying as a piece of business trivia. IBM wasn't foolish in any simple sense. Their engineers and executives were highly capable, and the decision made complete sense from inside IBM's own existing business model at the time. They were optimizing, rationally, for their existing, extremely profitable hardware business, the thing that had always made them money, and the thing their entire organization was built to sell and support. Software, in that specific worldview, was genuinely a supporting afterthought, a necessary ingredient rather than the main course. The mistake wasn't stupidity. It was evaluating the deal entirely through the lens of what IBM's business already was, rather than asking a separate, harder question: which piece of this specific arrangement is actually the valuable long-term asset, independent of which piece looks most important to our existing business model today? Those two questions can have very different answers, and the gap between them is exactly where Microsoft built its empire. This pattern shows up constantly in far smaller, far more ordinary partnership and vendor negotiations than a 5-decade-old story about the personal computer industry. A company negotiating a software vendor contract, a licensing deal, or even an internal partnership between two departments will very often focus its entire negotiating energy on the piece of the deal that maps most directly onto its own existing familiar business, while giving away, almost as an afterthought, the piece that turns out to be the actual long-term strategic asset once the surrounding market evolves in ways nobody at the negotiating table quite anticipated. Picture a company that builds physical hardware and hires an outside vendor to build the software layer that connects its product to customers' phones, treating that software as a minor implementation detail while focusing every negotiating hour on the hardware supply terms. If that connector software becomes the piece every customer actually interacts with daily, and the piece every competitor's product eventually needs to integrate with too, the vendor who built it, not the hardware company that commissioned it, may end up owning the actual valuable relationship with the end customer. The lesson for any manager negotiating a partnership, a vendor deal, or a licensing arrangement of any size is to ask, deliberately and explicitly, which piece of this specific arrangement is actually the valuable long-term asset, because it is rarely, almost by definition, the piece that looks most important to your own existing business model in the exact moment you're signing the agreement. So here's the practical, usable move for your very next vendor agreement or partnership negotiation. Before you sign anything, ask out loud in the room which single piece of this deal is the actual long-term asset, since history keeps showing it's rarely the piece that feels most important today. IBM built the machine. Microsoft owned what every one of those machines actually needed to turn on. There's an important technical and legal detail underneath the clone wave that made all of this possible in the first place. IBM published the full technical specifications of its original PC openly, including the source code for parts of its BIOS, the low-level firmware that lets an operating system talk to the hardware underneath it. Competitors like Compaq couldn't legally just copy that BIOS code directly, so engineering teams used a documented process called cleanroom reverse engineering, where one group studies exactly what the original BIOS does without ever seeing its source code, writes a detailed specification of that behavior, and hands that specification to a completely separate team that writes brand new code to match it. A legally defensible way to build fully compatible hardware without directly copying anyone's protected code. That legal path, combined with Microsoft's willingness to license the same operating system to any hardware maker who wanted it, is exactly what let an entire industry of PC clone manufacturers spring up within just a few years of IBM's original launch. Within about 2 decades, Microsoft's own market value would grow to rival and eventually surpass IBM's entirely, an outcome that would have sounded absurd to IBM's own leadership in 1980. When Microsoft was still a small vendor, they were doing a favor by giving early business to. Economists have a specific term for the advantage Microsoft ended up holding once its operating system became the de facto industry standard. Switching costs, the real, ongoing cost in money, time, and retraining that a customer or an entire industry has to absorb to move away from a dominant standard once enough other things depend on it. Once software developers, hardware makers, corporate IT departments, and everyday users had all built years of investment around MS-DOS, and then Windows, the cost of the entire industry switching to a different operating system became enormous, which is exactly what let Microsoft's position compound for decades rather than facing a serious open challenge. Later technology platforms clearly studied this exact history closely. Companies building their own app stores and developer platforms decades later structured very different agreements, deliberately keeping tighter control over distribution and licensing terms specifically to avoid ceding the same kind of unintentional long-term leverage IBM handed Microsoft in 1980. That shift in how platform deals get structured today is, in a very direct sense, an entire industry's institutional memory of exactly what happened the first time nobody thought to ask which piece of the deal was the real asset. It's worth pausing on why IBM specifically didn't see this coming, because the answer isn't simple carelessness, and understanding the actual reasoning is what makes the lesson transferable to your own negotiations. IBM's entire business, for decades before the PC project, revolved around large mainframe computers sold directly to big institutional customers, deals where the hardware genuinely was the overwhelming majority of the value, and where the software running on that hardware really was a comparatively minor, replaceable piece of the overall package. IBM's negotiators weren't applying a flawed general theory of business. They were applying a completely reasonable lesson from their own extensive, successful experience in a new situation where that lesson happened to be exactly backwards. This is precisely the trap that catches experienced, competent negotiators far more often than inexperienced ones. Because experience is what teaches you a specific pattern for what usually matters most in a deal. And that same hard-won pattern recognition becomes a genuine liability the moment you're negotiating in a market whose underlying economics work differently than the ones you learned your instincts in. A concrete way to guard against this in your own work. Before finalizing any partnership or licensing agreement, deliberately list out every distinct piece of the deal separately. The technology, the customer relationship, the data being generated, the branding, the distribution channel, and force yourself to rank them by which one becomes more valuable, not less, as the market around the deal grows larger. IBM's own mental ranking put hardware first because that's what had made them money for decades. A ranking based on which piece compounds with scale would have put the operating system first instead, and that one question difference is worth billions in hindsight. There's also a broader lesson here about who actually captures the value created when an entire industry standardizes around one piece of technology. IBM created the standard, in the sense that the world agreed to build compatible hardware around IBM's original design. But creating a standard and owning a standard turned out to be two completely different things, and only one of those two things compounds in value as the market grows. IBM captured the initial burst of attention and sales that came from launching the category. Microsoft captured the decades of recurring value that came from being the one piece every subsequent participant in that category had to pay to use. That distinction between the company that launches a category and the company that ends up owning its underlying standard is worth carrying into any negotiation where you're helping create a new market rather than just competing inside an existing one. Launching first feels like the valuable position in the moment. This story is one of the clearest examples in business history of why that instinct can be exactly backwards. The next time you're the company creating a brand new category, whether that's a new product format, a new industry standard, or simply the first version of an integration other companies will eventually build around, treat that moment as exactly the highest leverage point to ask which piece of what you're building will still matter once 50 other companies are relying on it too. IBM had that exact leverage in 1980 and spent it on the wrong line item entirely. It's worth remembering, in fairness to IBM, that this decision looked completely reasonable from every angle available to them at the time, which is exactly why the lesson generalizes so well. Nobody at IBM in 1980 could have known with certainty that the personal computer market would grow as large as it eventually did, or that clone manufacturers would proliferate as fast as they did once the legal path to building compatible machines was established. Hindsight makes the missed opportunity look obvious. In the room, in 1980, it was a defensible bet made by capable people optimizing for the business they actually understood, which is precisely the kind of decision worth studying closely, since the ones that only look wrong in hindsight are the ones most likely to repeat themselves in your own negotiations today. It's also worth noting that IBM itself didn't disappear because of this decision. The company remained a major, successful business for decades afterward, eventually exiting the personal computer hardware business entirely on its own terms in the 2000s to focus on services and enterprise software. A reminder that even a genuinely enormous missed opportunity doesn't automatically sink an otherwise well-run organization. It simply means someone else ends up capturing the value that opportunity was always going to create for somebody. That's actually the more useful, more common version of this lesson for most managers to internalize, since total company collapse from a single missed opportunity is rare, while quietly ceding a valuable long-term asset to a partner or vendor without ever noticing happens constantly, in negotiations too small to ever become a business school case study. The Toys R Us and MySpace and Friendster stories all ended in collapse. This one is arguably more instructive precisely because it didn't, and IBM's leadership went on running a large, respected company for decades without ever needing to publicly reckon with what that one licensing decision had actually cost them, which is exactly the kind of quiet loss that never triggers a company-wide reckoning on its own. Here's a concrete question worth asking in your very next vendor or partnership negotiation, drawn directly from the story. Before agreeing to any exclusivity terms, or the lack of them, ask specifically what happens to this deal if the market around it grows 10 times larger than it is today, and who benefits from that growth under the exact terms you're about to sign. IBM never asked that question about the operating system. Microsoft didn't need to ask it twice. More management theories like this hit follow.